So good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to have you here. It's just so odd to do things in real life, I have to say. So I'm really grateful for those of you who came out, particularly for people who aren't in Providence. It's been a really miserable day today, so I'm really grateful that you're here. So we're really excited about tonight's events, but we're actually really excited because this is our inaugural event as the Information Futures Lab. We launched in June, and so we're very lucky to actually have our interim dean, Dean Aubert, who's going to he said he would come and do some remarks, so we feel very grateful for that. So yeah, we'd love to welcome you up to maybe say a few things about what we have planned at the School of Public Health.
Thank you, Claire. Claire is one of my, I'm a huge fan, so I'm always starstruck when I'm in Claire's presence. But good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us as we launch the Information Futures Lab. With your support, this new initiative will tackle what I believe is one of the most important public health challenges of the 21st century, responding to the emerging information crisis that has shaped our lives so dramatically over the past few years. A few weeks ago, we had a great conversation at the State of the School event, in which I spoke with several colleagues about how the work of communications has become vital to the mission of public health. This is a generational shift in our work and in our training. For those of us, especially people like myself, who came of age and were trained before social media, public health communication was largely a one-way street. We shared information that we thought the public needed and expected that the public, at least some of them, would absorb this information and behave accordingly. At that time, only viruses went viral. Suffice to say, this is no longer the case. Due to social media, we each inhabit our own media ecosystem, curated in collaboration with algorithms whose goal is not to generate new information or accurate information, and its goal is not to keep us healthy. Consider this: 20 years ago, when this world stood on the brink of a pandemic, thanks to an outbreak of SARS-CoV-1, no one had an iPhone or Android. Facebook was months away from launching. Information on that outbreak flowed from virologists and public health scientists to the public through mainstream news organizations, staffed by fact checkers and seasoned reporters. 2 decades later, the COVID pandemic has been shaped at least as much by our emerging information crisis as it has by the viral structure of SARS-CoV-2. Information flows in every direction simultaneously, and we in public health have been left behind far too often. The consequences have fallen most of all on vulnerable communities struggling with structural racism, poverty, and marginalization. We have got to do better. The Information Futures Lab will work to build resilience to the information crisis in order to safeguard health. I look forward to having you join us on this journey. Now, I just want to introduce one quick story about an information session that I attended where Claire and her colleagues were introducing the Information Futures Lab Fellows Program. 70 or 80 people joined the call from all over the world. A lot of excitement. I was super excited about that. Sent the information to a colleague who was a fairly senior person at a very progressive, very cutting-edge health department, and with the thought that they would disseminate it to their colleagues in the department. Very quickly, I heard from this colleague that they have a great idea for a project and they'll be applying in January for the January cohort. So there's something very important that we're doing here, and we have a great team of colleagues to work with, and so I hand this back to Claire, who was really kind of the heart and soul of the Information Futures Lab. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much for those comments. And I think it's a reminder too, as we have this conversation, how do we really think about the intersection with public health? And I think from a regulatory perspective, we're always trying to find a way in, and harm, I think, through the pandemic, we've seen people think about misinformation differently because of health than we did when people were concerned about disinformation in elections. So thank you for those comments. So we're also co-hosting this event with the Data Science Initiative, and Suresh is here to represent that, but also the Algorithmic Transparency Institute. And so Cameron's here, and I just would love to hear a couple couple of words from you about why we're working together.
Sure. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Dean. I'm really excited. I want to congratulate you for the launch of the Information Futures Lab. I think it's an exciting new initiative, and we're really excited to be here co-hosting an event that's happened today and will be happening again tomorrow. We were running a workshop that is called Defining Transparency. So I think that the context of this conversation and this question today should really be thought of in the context of transparency and how transparency can help answer this question. When I first saw it, I was a little bit worried that the panelists would look at it, they would say, nope, drop the mic and walk out the door. But I do think that there are some good answers to that question if we think about it in the context of transparency. So I just want to welcome everyone here, and I want to hear the panelists, so let's get started.
Thank you, Cameron. And Suresh, maybe when we come to you, you can explain a little bit about DSI and how the intersection works there, because we're really excited about working with you about these sorts of things. Okay, so we're not going to do that thing where basically I read out the bios of everybody. Not only can you find them online, but we actually want to use the time to be much more interesting. But very quickly, Mark Scott, who's the Chief Technology Correspondent of Politico and has just joined us actually this semester as a fellow. And then Suresh, I'm going to get this wrong, but Suresh Venkasubramanian, who I met actually when you were kind of detailed to the White House to do work with OSTP, who's also a Brown professor, but just somebody who's thinking deeply about questions around bias and AI, and I think adds so much to so many of these conversations. And then Anna Sophie Harling, who I just met today for the first time, doing amazing work at Ofcom, which is the UK regulator. And Anna Sophie has already told us so many stories today about the realities of being a regulator and what you can ask, what you get back from the platforms. So I'm hoping we'll get maybe some anecdotes. Sometimes she's like, I can't answer that, Claire. And finally, Rebecca Tromble, who I've known for a long time. Again, first time I've seen Rebecca's legs today, which has been exciting. Taking everybody out of the Hollywood squares. But Rebecca has done some of the best work globally on this question of how can platforms share data with researchers safely. So for a long time, platforms have been like, we can't do this. Researchers say we need it, and we've just been in this kind of like holding pattern. But Rebecca recently published this report, which actually creates a roadmap of like, you can do this, and this is how you can do it. So I'm really excited about this star-studded panel, and I said, we'll just go down the line, basically, just with a very short introduction of the work that they're doing today in this space, but also a little bit of like how they got here, because I'm always interested in how people find their way to a particular profession. So maybe I can start with you, Rebecca.
Happy to kick things off. First things first, I can say the one disadvantage of being in person for all of these things is that indeed you can see my legs, and I can't do what I refer to as the Zoom mullet, which is business on top, yoga pants on bottom. It's a bit of a disadvantage, but still, I'm really pleased to see everybody in 3 dimensions and to meet a lot of people for the first time that I've admired their work and in some instances been working with closely, but have never had the opportunity to meet. So thank you for the excuse to bring us together. I am director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics, as well as an associate professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. So I'm based in DC, but I am doing the vast majority of the relevant work that we'll talk about today in Europe. And that came about because as a traditional empirical researcher trying to study online platforms and the impacts that they have on political communication in particular, but really, our daily lives, the ways that we interact with one another. I was interacting with various folks at Twitter, at Facebook, and beyond, and they were really promising people like me and my particular research teams the world in terms of how we could partner together, the sorts of information and data that they would share with us. And to be a bit frank, those were promises that got them good headlines. They could announce, oh, we are partnering with these researchers to do these things. And then the lawyers stepped in the room and put an end, right, to any of those big information provision promises that they had made. I was working at Leiden University in the Netherlands at the time. As I told folks today, I was an hour by high-speed train away from Brussels. And so I just started making a nuisance of myself in policymakers' offices. And eventually, it took a while, but we made some headway. And so together with a number of really excellent people across Europe, we've been working really, really hard to help ensure that independent researchers like myself, whether from academia or civil society, even to some extent journalists, can have much better access to the sort of core information that we need in order to, one, understand what the impacts of these platforms are on individuals, social groups, societies as a whole, and two, ultimately hold them accountable for any potential harms that they are creating. So that's what I'm here to talk to you more about today.
And Anna Sophie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really great to be here. I feel okay, even though I flew in last night from the UK. But if I mess up my words or don't make sense, it's jet lag. So I work at Ofcom. As Claire said, I am on the online safety policy team, and I run Ofcom's transparency reporting sort of strategy team. And what we're essentially trying to do is figure out what is the information that Ofcom needs in order to regulate some of the largest tech platforms in the world, and also medium and smaller size tech platforms. But also, what information do we think we need to publish in order both to empower the public and various audiences like researchers, civil society groups, legislators, and also the average social media users or parents who might want to know how safe is this app really and what actually happens when you open Snapchat. I've been really lucky to work on a smaller regulatory regime, which has allowed us to send information requests to certain platforms, which we're going to be publishing next month in a big report. And that's been a really interesting exercise. I think for one of the first times ever, a regulator actually sending information requests to social media platforms with enforcement action behind it, essentially saying, if you do not publish or if you do not send us this data, we can actually fine you. So that really shifts the tables and is, I think, quite necessary in order to be able to get to the information we really need. My background is a bit topsy-turvy. I'm American, as you can probably hear. I went to university in the US, and then I essentially moved to Europe and bounced around between a couple of different things. I didn't study policy or regulation or anything, and I ended up being in the right place at the right time and joining a startup that was helping to combat disinformation. And so I became really caught up in, why is it that a lot of, disinformation actually gets amplified above what we would consider to be credible news sources. And I spent 3.5 years doing that in Europe, and ended up applying to, the online safety regulator, which in some ways feels like a startup within a regulator, because we're kind of making it up as we go along and figuring out how to do something for the first time, and growing at a rapid pace. So we're also recruiting heavily, I should say. So, yeah.
Also, whoever's live tweeting, don't live tweet. We're making it up as we go along, says Ofcom regulator. Just saying. Thank you. Suresh.
Thanks, Claire. I'm Suresh Venkateswaranian. I'm the Deputy Director for the Data Science Initiative, as well as a professor here at Brown in computer science and data science. I'm a computer scientist by training. So, Claire, you want me to talk a little bit about DSI? And
Yeah.
Okay, so let me say a little bit about my history and how I got here, and then I'll say a little bit at the end about DSI. So, I'm a card-carrying computer scientist, like I tell people, and I'm in this space sort of through a combination of weird circumstances, partly by accident, partly by falling into it. But for the last 10 years or so, I've been looking at initially issues of bias and discrimination in algorithms and what it means to try and make a machine learning algorithm not discriminate. But over the years, this has become a bigger and bigger and bigger set of questions that is not just about bias in machine learning, but is really broadly about the societal impact of automated systems. And that includes, systems that, recommend information to us in various forms, but it also includes systems that make decisions about us in virtually every aspect of our lives. And so, the reason I think I'm on this panel is because for the last year or so, I've been at the White House at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. I just finished my term there, helping advise on tech policy and AI policy, but also as part of my portfolio, thinking through what a federal R&D strategy around misinformation and around information integrity would look like. Like that, not so much what the federal government should do about misinformation, but what kind of information does the federal government need to have to be able to inform the policy that it will make. So it's really a research and development strategy. So it involves, what kind of research could be encouraged to be funded, what kind of resources can be put into it. So that's kind of the stuff that I was doing there. And as far as DSI goes, DSI's initiative, hopefully soon to be an institute at Brown, that sort of looks at all the ways in which data can be used to support people and support research that sort of helps human flourishing in a data-driven world. And so it's a broad mandate. It includes, activities around the natural sciences. It includes more that I'm interested in around data and the social sciences, around the social sciences and algorithms, around use of algorithms in public health and in medicine. So there's a broad mandate for the use of data and the critical thinking around the use of data. Sometimes when data is not the answer, when you have a much broader holistic perspective on where data is helping and when it's not. So I'll stop there, and thank you for having me.
I love that you're card-carrying computer scientist, and you arrived with a shirt that's making jokes about Star Wars and coffee, and you said...
I'm a walking stereotype.
Mark?
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm not sure what time it is, frankly. I also just arrived from Europe, so I'm a bit jet-lagged too. I'm Politico's chief tech correspondent, but although we have a big office in DC, I'm based in Europe. Mostly because, to Rebecca's point, all digital policy, unfortunately, is coming out of Europe, not the US, and it's been that way for a long time. So both at Politico and then previously at the New York Times, I've covered every single European and US election since Brexit in 2016. That went well for everyone. And so that involves 2 French presidential elections, 2 German federal elections, an Irish abortion referendum, all the midterms and the 2020 election, and everything in between, plus the small thing of COVID, and then the Ukraine war and the effect of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda in all of that. On top of that, because I'm based in Europe, I've been quite close to the content moderation regulation coming out of both London, which is called the Online Safety Bill, which is supposed to empower Ash to do her job, as well as the Digital Services Act coming from Brussels, which is sort of a pan-European effort to regulate content and platforms. It's a lot going on. And so my frustration and why I'm quite excited to be a visiting fellow at the Information Futures Lab is that all this work I've been doing since 2016 is based on data and access to data, and I don't have it at all. And so what I'm very excited about, and we've had some discussions today about it, is how we get past that. So both I can, as a journalist, can do my work, researchers can do their work, and Ash and her regulatory colleagues can also get down to business. So I'm excited for what's going to happen next.
So what's going to happen next is I'm going to ask you a question, which is, you just threw out a lot of information, and so things like DSA and online safety. So if I am an American in the audience and I'm like, oh, I hadn't heard about these things, what are the core elements of those pieces of legislation that people here should really understand? And like Ash just talked about, we can find people, but maybe can you give us a primer on the DSA?
The cliff notes of the DSA. Okay, so the Digital Services Act, and to a lesser extent, sorry Ash, the UK's Online Safety Bill, is an effort to realize that the current online system is just unregulated. It just doesn't work. And therefore, we need to have a better sense of promoting trust and safety online. And in typical European fashion, it's a top-down statist response. There's no judgment, that's just how it is. And so what the Digital Services Act is trying to do is put together a set of provisions that not only require the platforms, Facebook and even some of the new ones like Telegram, to take a greater responsibility for what is promoted to their users, but also to show their homework. They have to say, okay, well, we've taken X, Y, and Z steps to mitigate harm and risk, and we can show you how we've done that. And so the goal with both the European Union's Digital Services Act and the UK's Online Safety Bill is to create a safer online space by empowering regulators and to a lesser degree journalists and civil society to hold the platforms to account through a variety of yet to be written provisions that say you can do this, you can do that, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so what's really interesting about now is that the European Union have passed their rules, the Brits, for a variety of reasons, also because the Queen just passed away, haven't got there yet, but it's coming. Those rules are now set in stone, but the detail hasn't been figured out yet. So what's really interesting about what's going to happen in the next 12, 18 months is all that content moderation policy that's going to come out of Europe is going to get written, and it's going to have a direct effect what happens in the US. Because, like it or not, like we saw with some of the European privacy standards, what happens in Europe just gets exported globally, at least within the West. And so my bet would be that a lot of the things that the Europeans get offered in terms of online safety in the next 12, 18 months are going to be offered here as well.
And so if I can build on that, Anna-Sophie, so as a UK regulator, we're not in Europe anymore because of Brexit. So therefore, that's why the UK we're similar to the US in that whatever happens. But how do you regulate for just our little island when fundamentally these are platforms that come out of the US? When you're asking for data, it's just about people who live on the island.
Well, I guess the answer to that is we don't ask for data about the people. So what we're really interested in is how do these platforms actually operate? And for example, if you were to take the case of misinformation, there's some information we have that exists publicly about how the rules that platforms have towards misinformation. But the big question is, they say that they don't allow certain types of misinformation, and yet it's very easy for people to say, well, I've logged on to this platform and I see it everywhere. And you see lots of articles from journalists or researchers saying, this content is available freely. And then you get the classic, the platform apologizes and then takes it down. And the reason why I think we have regulation is because we want platforms to start to proactively do more rather than just respond to public pressure. So I think, from a regulatory standpoint, you have to think about, what are the incentives you put in place to fundamentally change the way in which platforms think about online safety. So ideally, we would create a regulatory environment in which products, which are being built largely in the US, in Silicon Valley or Menlo Park, in which those products are being built with online safety considerations in mind. What we've seen so far is that platforms build products, release them, and then weeks or months or years later, a problem arises. And ideally, we'd want the product developers and engineers to have a trust and safety specialist next to them saying, have you considered how this might actually lead greater harm in, either illegal content or misinformation or hate speech, or might drive, some people down a rabbit hole? And so I think actually, because those are often product decisions and often sort of governance questions about how the platform thinks about online safety, those are the changes, as Mark said, that aren't just going to be affecting the UK, because actually none of the product teams sit in the UK. They all sit in the US. And if changes happen as a result of UK legislation or European legislation that influence the product and the company, then the US consumers are going to see an impact there, because it's a lot more difficult and expensive for platforms to make a safer UK internet, which also doesn't exist, because UK consumers see American content, Ukrainian content, and content from Japan, right? You can't cordon off the internet. So I'm less worried about creating a world in which just the UK is safe and nowhere else is. But I do think we have a responsibility as well to ask platforms about how they're implementing their policies and building up teams in countries that don't speak English and aren't necessarily in the West and don't have regulatory regimes that are coming in. So I think there are a lot of countries around the world that might be looking at regulation coming out of the West to make sure that those policies are applied in their countries as well.
Nobody would know you just got off a plane.
No.
Remarkable.
I'm starting to flag. I'm like panting.
So I just want to get at this, we've obviously the title that was designed to get people to click on an Eventbrite. But so we're talking about misinformation and we're like, oh, yeah. Actually, illegal content, which is child sexual abuse imagery or terrorist content, there's more of an understanding and agreement about what that is. Misinformation, there are a lot of platforms that don't actually have misinformation policies and would argue quite rightly, as a society, we don't actually have an agreed upon definition of that. So I'm just going to throw this out, 'cause it's not an easy question, but how do we regulate something that actually is really slippery? And if I asked all of the people in the audience, probably would come up with different answers. Or I had 10 examples, we'd all say different things about those 10 examples. So how do you start to regulate content when we can't agree on what we mean?
So there is a overused saying within the European Commission where they do not want to create the Ministry of Truth, right? And what we saw with the Department of Homeland Security recently, that led to some issues on this side of the US.
Do you just want to explain that very briefly, Mark?
Yeah, there was an effort to create sort of a governance structure around disinformation, and then that led to a lot of pushback from people on the right of politics saying, well, you're trying to censor us, this is, free speech, First Amendment, and those are, as a journalist, I fully agree. But I think it kind of missed the point. I think my view on misinformation is that there is a degree. Everyone, including myself, can be wrong and be an idiot, right? I'm mostly an idiot all the time. And that's fine, but then if that then gets amplified by a certain number of levers, product choices within a platform, and that stupidity, be it, I think 5G causes COVID, or whatever it is. I mean, obviously I don't agree with that, but everyone has a right to be wrong. But if then the algorithms and the product choices within those companies amplify that to a point where it becomes a public health issue, I think that disassociates the content from the platform and how that is spread. And I think the best part of the content rules coming out of Europe right now are content agnostic, and they look at the system approach. And I think Ash put it really, I'm going to borrow that going forward, looking at that safety by design baked in is where we should be focusing the regulation rather than trying to say, well, this is a misinformation because I believe in X, because we're never going to agree. But taking an agnostic approach and looking at the system is why I think where we should be focusing.
Suresh.
I just wanted to respond to that as well, because I agree with pretty much most of what you said there about how the approach should work and how we should think about content agnostic things. One of the tricky things and this is in the US context, I think, and is that there is a sort of a view, or at least a set of viewpoints around the idea that algorithmic amplification itself can be viewed as a kind of speech, and that gets caught up not just in First Amendment protections, but Section 230 protections. And maybe I should
Yes, can you give us a Section 230 primer?
The 23 words that built the internet. There's a whole book on this. It's actually a thing. But the idea of Section 230, which is a clause in a bill, I think from the middle 90s. I don't even remember the name of the bill. The Communications CDA, I think it was called, the Act. Was the idea that, and at this time in 1995, okay, this is pre-Facebook, pre-social media, pre-anything, frankly, just not pre-horrible HTML1, but that's a different story. That platform should not be held, the idea was that platform should not be held liable for content that people place, because at that time, platforms was, I don't know, GeoCities, and you put up a web page, and you put a web page with some screed about something. GeoCities should not be held liable for your screed. You should be held liable if your screed, or you sort of intentionally harm someone or something that goes beyond the bounds of what free speech would limit. And so the idea of Section 230 was to provide this kind of indemnification of platforms against this. Now you fast forward to 2022, and now you have Facebook, turbocharging content, using amplification techniques. The question of the day, and different people have very different answers to this, is this still a thing where Section 230 should be protecting what platforms? Are they still merely places where people place content? Or is the active amplification of Mark's 5G equals COVID comment doing more than just hosting him and letting him say it? Is it the act of spreading, is it more active? Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds of that argument, but there's a roiling argument about it, and that's what's stymieing, I think, even content agnostic thinking around algorithm amplification. I agree, is a core source of the problem, because of this question of, is the active amplification a form of speech of a kind, and therefore, in the US context, protected more than others?
And Suresh, because you've kind of got us there, we started off by talking about what's happening in Europe and the UK. And so there might be people watching like, so why is the US, or appears to be, behind? A, do you think that US regulatory framework is behind? I mean, there's a lot of things bubbling at the state level. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered, what's your take on where the US is in some of these conversations?
I'm curious as to what you think, but I'll give my answer first, because I'm sure you're watching from the Ofcom side. The US is behind. It is very, very far behind. Part of it is by, sorry?
You could tweet that.
Part of it is by design, And part of it is, I think the political and structural landscape within how the US thinks about speech and media and the role of innovation are just some fundamental blockers that make it harder to think about these issues. In Europe, I think, at least from my external perspective, there's more of a willingness to sort of do these things top down, to say this is a problem and we need to have a top down way of doing it. There is really, it is very hard to start these kinds of conversations in the US at all. I mean, the FTC is undermanned, they're outmanned, the FCC as well. They've been in sort of stasis for the longest time because they didn't have the right number of commissioners to do anything. And of course, as the administrations change, the politics of the FCC also changes. They don't, I think they've tried in recent months, years, to sort of take a more aggressive stance on some particular forms of platform behavior. But because of that, because of the First Amendment, because of Section 230, and because of a general, much more innovation, business-friendly environment, not to mention $100 million in lobbying fees, it's a lot harder to get things going here, even though there is recognition that there are problems. There is state-level things, like California essentially took the UK AADC and has signed into law. And there are much more controversial bills now coming out of Texas and Florida, which are attempting to do something about social media in ways that are tricky and messy in their own way.
Yeah.
So that's where, in the laboratories of democracy, the states think that's the laboratory we're getting right now. So, but I think the window, there was a privacy bill that was cooking in Congress recently, and that would have done something. I think, another last thing I'll say is that a lot of what works at the EU, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but it seems to me that GDPR made a lot of things a lot easier to do because you had that as a layer to base everything off of. Without even something like that in the US, even though US companies have to comply with GDPR, they don't have to comply within the US. And without that, it sounds like every time you try to start doing something with data, with platforms, you're stuck with the fact that you don't have anything anything like a data protection regulation that many countries have.
Yeah.
I'll stop there.
So thank you for that. And Rebecca, as somebody who has worked in both Europe and now in DC, what's your take on this?
My take is unfortunately not particularly optimistic for this side of the ocean. There was a hearing just last week in the Senate where every single person in both parts of the hearings, both in the first part where it was experts testifying and the second part where it was actually platform representatives, to a person said, we need greater transparency as a first step. They all pointed to a particular potential piece of legislation. It's been written, it hasn't even been introduced in either one of the chambers, what's affectionately known as PATA, which is essentially about researcher data access, right? Access to this information that I was talking about at the very beginning, to a person. Everyone said, we need this. I watched that and thought, that's lovely, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere, right? Even having that level of agreement and enthusiasm for one particular piece of legislation, it is just so hard right now to get around, right, the real political barriers that we see day in and day out. But that said, right, I have an incredible amount of optimism because precisely, right, as Ofcom has described for us, anything that happens in the UK and particularly in the EU right now is going to have positive knock-on effects for US users as well. What we're looking at here, what the primary goal is to develop a sort of regulatory system that requires the platforms to kind of reconfigure their basic modus operandi, right? Reconfigure even some of their infrastructural pieces. And anytime they have to do that at that high of a level, it means that it makes the product, it makes the end outcome better for everyone.
And just a little anecdote, Rebecca and I were actually on a task force looking at disinformation in Ukraine. And as part of that, we asked all the platforms for data, like a really low-level ask. Yeah. And we didn't hear anything back. We heard back from one platform, Facebook, 4 months later, and they basically admitted to us that they were so busy getting ready for the Digital Services Act in Europe that all of their engineers were working on that and they couldn't possibly help us. But I was like, actually, I don't really care. If you're going to do that, then that's good. So I think that question of how many people they have on which teams, how much they're resourcing it, can only be a good thing.
Yeah.
But Rebecca, going back to that data point, you're saying you don't think this bill is going to happen. You have done a lot of work on this. What's kind of the top line? There's probably many people here or watching online who are researchers. Like, what's your argument about actually these platforms can give away some of this data safely? Like, talk to us a little bit about your thinking.
Let me take a step back to contextualize this a little bit, right? I think we first of all have to answer the question, why is it important for independent researchers to actually access this sort of information? And there, I think we go back to a long history across a number of industries. Take the automotive industry, right, as one example, where there's actually long tradition and policies in place such that, right, these industries have to share basic safety data, right, with regulators, with independent watchdogs, and so on. And that's the only way, right, that we as the public learn about these different safety concerns and harms. It's ultimately why automakers feel pressured to recall and so on. The problem is, right, the basic difference between that type of data and what we're talking about here is that data from the automotive industry or almost any other industry that we could compare this to does not involve individual users, right? They're not sharing data that ties back to a specific driver or passenger in a car. Here, we are always talking about data that ties back to those individual users. And to be frank, right, as someone who absolutely advocates for greater access to precisely these types of data, we have to acknowledge that there is a fundamental trade-off between transparency on the one hand and privacy on the other. And so the question is, how do we find that right balance? And the work that I've been leading as chair of a working group that was set up by the European Digital Media Observatory is to develop a code of conduct. We released the draft code at the end of May that lays out precisely the rules of the road under GDPR, under the world's leading privacy regulation. And what we've shown is that both platforms and researchers, right, can enter into these data access regimes in ways that are legal and, most importantly, are ethical, responsible, and keep the rights and the needs of the users themselves at the heart of considerations. So just to give you a little bit of detail on this, right? We spell out in this draft code, we spell out a risk assessment framework, right? That helps people understand, helps researchers and again platforms evaluate if I were investigating this particular question and looking at this particular type of data, right? Here's the framework that I would use to understand how risky that might be. Then once you've applied, right, the risk assessment framework, you can categorize the data as low risk, medium risk, high risk. And again, following the strictures of GDPR, but frankly, just good research practice. We lay out a ton of practicalities in terms of if this is low risk, here are the minimum things that researchers have to do. If this is medium risk, here's what researchers and platforms have to do. Here's the sort of mechanism for data sharing that we recommend. If it's high risk, here's how we ratchet it up, right, so that you still can get access to that information because some of the most vital data is the highest risk. It is the riskiest information. But, right, we put all sorts of organizational and technical security features on that to mitigate that risk, reduce it as much as possible. And then it ultimately comes down to holding both the platforms and especially the researchers, right, responsible should there be any abuses of that access.
if you're interested, you should Google this report. It's excellent. And also, I failed, because I'm back to doing this, is that there's a hashtag. I totally forgot. So if you want to ask a question, it's hashtag IFL panel. So we're going to open for questions shortly. But so often in these debates, and we had a workshop today, there's multi-stakeholder events, and people come from academia and journalism and public health and different things. But my mum never gets invited. And fundamentally, this impacts everybody. I mean, how do we get people to care? And I think going back to some of these opening comments about even the definition of misinformation, is it that we should just be thinking about harm as a way to get people to care? Like, your uncle was spreading the 5G COVID thing and has caused, I'm just interested in how do we get the public as part of these conversations, and how do we get them to care? Because fundamentally, policymakers are looking to the public to see what the public cares about, and then that's more likely to move the needle. So I wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that. Mark Scott, he's ready.
I'm ready. I spend a lot of this time mostly because I want to write for an audience. I'm trying to frame this in some way so people like yourselves will read what I write, for my ego mostly. But I think for me, there's misinformation about misinformation. I think everyone says oh yeah, because I've seen something on Facebook, or the Russians are behind this. Well, no. Most of it is just because, again, my basic point, people are stupid. And people will put up stupid things.
I don't think that's just going to help my mum care about this issue.
But I think people need to be... But I think we need to be honest about this, that people will always say stupid things. They said it before Facebook, they'll say it after Facebook, and that's fine. But to get people to care, I think, and this is where I struggle, is there is a sort of machine, an industrial complex of social media that is very difficult to understand, and I don't think the average person is going to need to or take the time to, as much as I would like them to, and I spend a lot of my time trying to explain this. At some point you go, well, and this sounds maybe a bit too paternalistic, but do they need to understand all the algorithmic amplification and the data tracking? Is that really going to help them say, well, no, that post of my uncle is wrong? Something that I think we need to be conscious of where the limits are and go, yes, people should pay attention, people should be more aware of this, but we also shouldn't have the bogeyman of the Russians are trying to interfere in elections, or there's misinformation everywhere. Well, no, again, forgive me, people can just be stupid sometimes.
Rebecca.
So I'm going to admit something that seems probably pretty counterintuitive, because I am a disinformation researcher. I run an institute that looks into, investigates disinformation, among other things. I think that actually the public needs to know less about mis and disinformation in some ways. When we first started talking about these issues, we were talking about fake news, right, first and foremost. And I was based in the Netherlands at the time. Journalists would call me, right, all the time and ask me, how worried should we be about fake news?
It's probably Mark.
And
Yeah.
it was never Mark.
Sorry.
It was never Mark. My answer was always, every time you talk about it, I'm going to be more worried. That is not to say that mis and disinformation aren't problems. They absolutely are. That has become so abundantly clear in the midst of pandemic, with COVID-19 still, right, prevalent. But one of the real conundrums, the sort of catch-22 of all of this focus on mis and disinformation, is that we've created an environment where people have lost trust in fundamental information ecosystems. It's not just that they don't know where to look, it's that they don't trust anybody to say anything at any time. And so those who are doing the good work, including, really valuable journalism, reporting, folks just don't trust them anymore. They don't trust our basic political institutions because everyone's lying all the time. And I'm not quite sure how we get ourselves out of that. And it's not that we entirely stop talking about mis and disinformation, but I think it's actually less of a concern that we focus on driving more public attention to these sorts of problems. I worry that more attention actually makes this a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And I think just to add on that, we're at the lab, we're doing a literature review of a lot of interventions. And when you look at some of the media literacy interventions, people get smarter at spotting misinformation, but they also start to become much more critical of trusted news information. I feel like Mark calling everybody stupid might be playing into the people not
No,
trusting
I'm not calling
journalists.
myself stupid.
Oh, no, sorry, everybody else. Suresh.
So your question, it sounded to me like could be answered one of two ways, right? So it sounded like you were asking two things. How to get more people into the discussions
Yeah.
who are not the standard stakeholders, the academics, and
Yeah.
also how to make people care more.
Yeah.
So I heard a lot of the answers to maybe the second part, and I wanted to say a bit about the first part as well, right? So one of the things that, when we were trying to, well, it's still ongoing, this sort of putting together this report on, federal R&D strategy around misinformation, we were trying to understand the different vectors of harms. And there was one particular session I remember very distinctly because it just stuck with me, where we had representatives from actually, groups like the AARP, and talking about, the harms that seniors are facing in one part of Florida. And the harms are financial harms. That basically the scam that they were encountering was so people basically saying, oh, click on this thing, you'll get this deal, and of course it was a financial scam. It wasn't the traditional kind of misinformation about elections or about health, but it was a specific kind of financial harm that was affecting only them. There was another story we heard about, this, I'm sure all of you know this story, but it was shocking to me, this bird sanctuary at the border in Texas that got caught up in misinformation that implied that they were A, trafficking immigrants, or B, doing sort of sexual trafficking of immigrants. Mm-hmm. And the protest basically shut down the bird sanctuary just because it happened to be at the border in a town where this controversy was going on. And again, it was a specific vector of harm for a specific entity dealing with that. So these stories, I think, had two values, at least the way I thought about them. Number one, they contextualize the harms in very specific ways that allow you to think not about misinformation broadly, but okay, what do we do about seniors getting scams online? And maybe the solution there looks nothing like the solution anywhere else, but it's something that relates to something that people were concerned about. But it does the opposite also, because I suspect that, politicians are much more likely to listen to what to do about our seniors who are getting hit by scams than the broad question of misinformation that sounds like they're being muzzled, at least in the US context. So to me, and I guess that was one way to think about your question, right? There are, even if you can't get members of the public to articulate their concerns because it's hard to articulate what is wrong, there have been people on the ground. I remember your presentations, Claire, about, looking at what people are doing on the ground, that local, and bringing that local information back up. Even if you're doing policy discussion at the top level, that really is helpful here.
And I think, going back to public health, when you talk to people about, maybe that person who's pushing an anti-vax sentiment, let's look at their website. Oh, look, they're selling a lot of supplements. Do you think there's a reason that they're pushing that? And then it becomes less about the confirmation bias of why you've believed it in the first place, and you're starting to talk about manipulation. And this isn't quite misinformation, but I want to talk a little bit about getting people to care about the collection of data. So today in our workshop, we were talking about how much data gets collected by the platforms and then how much platforms infer from that data. So they collect all that stuff from me, but then they're making inferences from the data I've collected. And I sometimes, I teach, in fact, one of my students is here tonight. And sometimes when I talk to students about data collection and tracking, they're like, thing is, Claire, I get really good ads on Instagram. Is that a problem? And I always wonder, what's the thing to get people to care? And I often say, well, okay, if you're 20, your whole life you've had data collected on you. And what if in 30 years' time you can't get health insurance because a company has inferred that you're likely to have diabetes, blah, 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 blah. What do we think about that from a regulatory perspective, about thinking about the data that's being collected as a way of getting people to care? Are there examples that you think that we could be doing? I don't know if anyone...
I can touch on this.
Yeah.
If you want me to start off. I come at this also in part, right, as a professor who's talking to my students about precisely these things. I think we've actually come a long way down that road, especially in younger generations, just in the last 2 or 3 years. And interestingly, I think TikTok has been a big help with that because, right, Gen Z's obsession with the algorithm on TikTok has actually helped really increase basic understanding of what's happening on platforms and how data is being collected and processed, and is generating a great deal of concern, right? That said, I think that there are some really useful and honestly terrifying examples that we can share. I am profoundly disturbed and worried about all of the so-called geofencing activities that are happening with law enforcement, with private companies, essentially knowing where we are at any moment in time. And then when they're trying to figure out, right, what we have been up to, because they have our geographical location and they can trace it in such incredible detail, right, they can figure out essentially what we've been up to at any particular moment in time. And that is being used in really powerful and terrifying ways by state actors, law enforcement actors, and frankly, right, just bad people like stalkers and so on. And I think those sorts of examples can help. I say that though, and it's not that I want, right, everyone to walk around terrified that they're being followed constantly. And so finding that balance between raising awareness and, you know, potentially having that almost kind of backfire effect of getting people so scared of these things that it turns into a unproductive conversation. I'm still trying to figure out where we and how we strike that balance.
And it makes me think even about thinking about ethical guidelines and risk assessments for all sorts of organizations. So Brown University has access to everybody's swipe card data, so knows where people are all the time. So there's those questions for almost any institution now about what do we do with that data? How do we use it? How do we not use it? How do we safeguard it? So it just is partly living in 2022. But Mark, you wanted to say something?
I think it comes down to concrete examples. So, you know, I have no problem with people wanting more targeted ads on Instagram. That is a choice that he or she's going to make. Okay, I disagree, but do what you want. I'm a privacy geek at heart, and so I've turned off all my tracking on my phone, and I just don't want it. It's my personal choice, and people can disagree or not. I worked with some researchers this year, who they gave me a burner phone, and then I downloaded some of the apps, and then after about 3 months, they then took that information and sort of tried to guess what I was like online. The idea was to try and, like, if I was really going to be embedded, immersed into this world, how much data would the companies have on me? As a sort of proxy for, like, okay, in real life, what does this look like? It came out with some interesting stuff. The one thing I want to say is that I had turned off all the tracking from Google for years. I was very fortunate to live in Rome for a bit, and the researchers came back with this information on me from my time in Rome that not only pinpointed my location, my address, based on a variety of metrics that Google still had access to, even if I turned it all off. But the thing that worried me the most was Google then had created a graph on me on where they thought I would go next, based on my geolocation data. And that freaked me out, not only because I thought I turned everything off, but Google was making, and I presume they're not the only company, making suppositions about my next movement so they could sell ads against me. And I think for me, that was a clear, concrete example of Instagram ads, great. But that level of sophistication in terms of knowing where you are using a bunch of metrics that you don't have access to, and then guessing where you go next, is a level of surveillance which I don't think anyone should be comfortable with.
And I didn't pay you to say that, but we're actually using that same technology next week for an event here. So if you are in any way interested in looking at that for yourself, come see me at the end so we can sign you up for that, because, we heard about this because Mark had done it, and I was like, yeah, we should bring that here.
I can't, you should do it. You can download your data. It doesn't take very long. I'm not a technical person. I'm not a computer scientist, and it was enlightening. So if you can, I would recommend it.
So amazingly, we're coming towards the end of our hour before we throw it up to questions. And I'm going to talk about unintended consequences, because often I get asked by people, surely we just need more regulation. And I say, actually, I don't have enough data to even tell you how bad the problem is. I can't tell you how much misinformation there is out there and what impact it's having on public health or like belief in election systems, et cetera, et cetera. And I say my biggest concern is that we regulate now with a knee-jerk reaction because everybody's talking about it, and historians look back at us and say, well, that was a stupid move. You did something that fundamentally broke the internet because you were so scared. And so, Ash, I'm going to turn to you for a second. Like, what's some of the unintended consequences you fear about regulation that hasn't been thought through?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I'll start with just my area, which is transparency reporting. So a lot of the big platforms currently publish transparency reports, and if anyone's nerdy enough to actually look at them, the kinds of data that they publish tend to be largely around metrics of how many pieces of content they remove of certain types of harmful content. They'll have metrics around how long it took them to remove a certain type of content, how many accounts they removed under the age of 18. And I think the expectation so far from a regulatory standpoint is that a regulator will come in and say, okay, these are the metrics we really care about, and now every platform has to publish those metrics. And I worry a lot about unintended consequences and perverse incentives that essentially any regulator setting any kind of benchmark is going to set. And I'll give you a couple of examples. If Ofcom comes out and says, we think a metric of success is that you remove increasingly more pieces of misinformation, that means that you're doing a good job. The unintended consequence is that a platform will say, okay, we'll just remove more stuff. Equally, if we say actually we want to see a decrease, and then that's great because it means that there's less misinformation on your platform, then platforms might be incentivized to remove less harmful content. If we publish a metric that, if we say a good metric is how long it took you to remove a certain piece of content on average, platforms might be incentivized, A, to remove pieces of content more quickly with less review, or if a piece of content that's gone viral for 6 days, suddenly emerges as disinformation, they might be incentivized to just leave it up because they don't want to skew their metrics. For essentially every piece of type of, metric that you can think of, there are myriad types of unintended consequences and perverse incentives that you can think of. So that's definitely one of the areas we've been thinking about a lot, which is how do you create meaningful metrics that actually tell you something about how well the platforms are genuinely taking, protecting their users from different types of harms. And I actually think those questions are a lot more difficult to come to than you can imagine. And then there are all sorts of other unintended consequences, which is just generally platforms have finite resources. If we tell them to go focus on research access, that might take them away from other things they might do on trust and safety. If a regulator like the DSA comes out and requires all sorts of expensive things, they might end up spending a lot of time fulfilling the regulatory requirements, but less time on going after coordinated inauthentic behavior, whatever it is. So I think we have to think from a regulatory standpoint, how do we make sure we don't just execute on the online safety bill and the DSA and make platforms do the things they're meant to do? And how do we make sure we focus on like the 3 things that would make a really big difference? Because both the DSA and the online safety bill are such huge pieces of legislation. We're talking about like thousands of platforms and 100 harms and millions of users, and the question is like, where do you begin? And so we almost have to take a really big step back and say, we have to kind of look at this from like a governance perspective, product perspective, like where can we come in and make a difference? Because if we start trying to go after like specific pieces of content or specific policies, we're going to also be out-regulated because they're developing their products way faster than we can keep up with them. So I think those are some of the things that we've been thinking about, which is how do we stay ahead of the curve and how do we make sure we don't essentially create a regulatory space that ends up worsening the problem rather than getting to the core of what is causing the harm.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any comments? I mean, I was just going to say, we don't necessarily have the expertise on the panel, but we focus a lot on the UK and Europe. But I think the other thing we have to recognize is there are many other countries around the world that are looking at these kind of regulations and seeing them as an excuse to clamp down on speech. And so the challenge here is we might be like, oh, it's okay that the UK is doing this, or, Germany famously had their fake news law in January 2017. They moved very quickly, but it ended up kind of being a blueprint for other countries that, well, Germany did it, so we can do it too. Insert regime that we didn't really want to do that.
What China is trying to do right now, which is a very different take altogether.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that, sorry?
I know very little about it, but basically the Chinese approach to recommendation systems is, first of all, much more intrusive. They're asking for much, much more detail from companies on what, and it's still TBD as to how much information is being given and what's going to be done with it. And a lot of this is wrapped up into the politics, internal politics in China. But also there's this thing that keeps coming up, right? It's not enough for platforms to remove harmful content. They must promote beneficial content.
Yeah.
So that's a whole other dimension that is different from anything that, you would see in the EU or even remotely in the US. It's a whole, and how that's going to play out, again, remains to be seen.
Yeah. Rebecca and then Mark.
Yeah, I do want to say, I want to push back on what you just said just a little bit, Claire.
Feel free to.
I think it's right that, yes, you put out these big regulatory regimes in good places, right? Like Europe and the UK and maybe eventually the US, however good they really are. And that the bad actors, right, the repressive states step forward and use those things as excuses, saying this is a model. You know what? They're going to do that thing anyway. They're going to, right, they're repressing speech whether or not they have the Digital Services Act to point to and say, well, Europe did it. And to be honest, they're not actually doing what the Digital Services Act or, right, the online harms bills are doing any of that. They're going way, way, way above and beyond, and it's a convenient talking point and little else. I just don't, in the end, worry that much about how any of the work that we're doing will or will not empower bad actors, because those bad actors will find ways to empower themselves.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, I think the question of the fragmentation of the internet is for another panel.
Yes.
But what it means around what, the Indian government right now is demanding of platforms,
Yep.
or, those kind of things, like it's a very different internet than it was 10 years ago. Mark?
One thing I think we need to also take into consideration is competition. We've talked about online content, we've talked a little bit about privacy, but there is a space right now where there are 5 to 7 gatekeepers, at least in the Western-style non-Chinese internet. And therefore, what we saw with the European privacy regime, which became the global de facto, was that because the regulatory costs were so high, it baked in existing corporate structures to give Google, Facebook, and everyone else, basically, they cemented their power because of the regulation. And I look at the EU DSA and the UK's online safety bill, and there's, as Hash said, there's a lot in there, like a lot. And therefore, if we're looking to incentivize competition and maybe allow other social media platforms and other to flourish, how do you do it so everyone is kept safe to a certain level, but you allow startups with 5 people to have fewer regulatory burdens than Meta does? Because then, if everyone has to say the same level of safety and regulatory oversight, you end up with nothing changing.
Yeah.
And I can speak to this a tiny bit. So we're currently regulating a group of 18 video sharing platforms in the UK under a narrower regime that's carried over from some EU directives. So that's one last thing we brought over right around the time of Brexit. And there's some big names in there, TikTok, Snap, Vimeo, Twitch, OnlyFans. And then there are some platforms you'll have never heard of, like the Sponsor Hub and Curio and Reveal Me. And these are platforms that oftentimes have like 2 or 3 employees. And so one of the things we've had to think about as we regulate them, as we set up meetings, send information requests, publish data, how do we take into account proportionality in how we do that? And proportionality, I'd say, and I'm going to sound like a regulator, but proportionality is at the heart of everything we do, because we have to take into this competition, the transparency reporting requirements, for example, are only going to apply to the largest platforms. So smaller platforms do not have to publish any data. They have actually only one thing they really need to do, which is their, illegal content risk assessment. And they don't have to publish that anywhere. So what we consider to be the long tail, most of the platforms that have like 5 or 10 employees, nothing's really going to change, except they might have to do a risk assessment once a year where they have to essentially check, is there a risk of CSAM or terrorist content on my platform? The responsibilities ramp up a lot when you get to medium-sized and larger platforms. And I think that's right. And so when we sent out our information requests, we sent the most questions to TikTok And some of the smaller platforms only got, very few questions. And we wouldn't necessarily push back on those smaller platforms when they said, we don't actually have that system in place. We don't collect that data. We don't currently track that safety feature. Because we think that's pretty fair, and the cost of requiring them to implement that measure might be more than they make in revenue that year. So that we always have to think about that, the proportionality standpoint. I think that is probably one of the most important things for us to consider as we, even with some of the larger platforms, transparency reporting can be really, really expensive. So also prioritizing what information we get them to publish is actually one of the things we've been working on.
I'm going to go to Suresh for a second, but we're going to open to questions. So if anybody has a question, old school, can you come and stand at the mic? There are people in chat over here, but Suresh.
Yeah, I wanted to just add a layer of, I think, complication.
Great.
It's not complicated already, right?
More research needed.
On the not more research, but on the competition angle, right? So I'm personally quite happy that there isn't interoperability with Truth Social or with Gab. This does not grieve me too much.
Do you just want to explain that for a second?
Well, so Truth Social is the social network that was created by former President Trump to sort of transmit to his supporters once he got banned from Twitter. Gab was a network that was created around the time, a little bit before Jan 6th, but around that time, that was, for a while implicated in, or at least allegedly implicated in sort of support and pushing out information that maybe have helped the Jan 6th sort of organization, and was taken down from platforms for a while, now is back up again, because they have now checks and balances in place that they said we'll keep the conversations in check there. So on the one hand, I think interoperability or sort of competition or increasing the ability for smaller platforms is good. If you have everything on Facebook and on Twitter, and then they have maybe way too much power and control. On the other hand, now you know which of the big 5 or 6 platforms you have to go and talk to when you have to deal with the problem, let's say Ukraine misinformation. And now when you have 100 of them, and they're all doing their own thing, well, one argument is, well, they're not going to have a huge impact if they're very small. The problem is some very effective forms of misinformation are very targeted, focus on very small groups in very small areas, and have an impact. If you want to change something in a particular congressional district, you don't need to reach many people to do it. And so I'm not saying this is a reason not to do any of these things. It's just that it creates another layer of complexity and unintended consequences that have to be addressed somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we have a silly title, but there's this idea, often we surely just need more regulation. And it's only when you start having these conversations and you hear about the realities, it's very different. So we've got some questions in from the live stream. And the first one sort of makes me smile a little bit. I think if we remember the time that Zuckerberg was in front of Congress, it was like April, May 2018. And the questions were dreadful, like from every congressperson. And so somebody's saying, do you think that US policymakers have now got better at asking the necessary questions to provide the kind of oversight we're talking about?
Happy to take that one first. Yes, absolutely. We were actually talking about this a bit earlier at the workshop. I think that this is down fundamentally to a number of really key civil society actors really contributing to training up and informing people who were going to go advise these very policymakers. We're just building up a level of expertise that has been really, really helpful to ensuring, the folks on the Hill themselves, right, the members of Congress, the senators, they don't get all of it, by a long shot. But they're answering, they get a lot more, and they're asking much, much more intelligent questions, and they're not taking the kind of Zuckerberg, oh, well, we're going to build, we have AI for that, right, answer, and being like, oh, magic, okay, cool. That is no longer the both starting and finishing point for those conversations. So the thing that I am most optimistic about in terms of the overall regulatory landscape in the US is if we can get around some of the current hurdles that are created by the political environment, we have a group of legislators, we're seeing much more expertise in the executive as well, that we can potentially really move on some of these things in productive ways.
a question from the floor.
Can I just plus one
Oh, yeah.
Rebecca's point and add another point? I mean, I completely agree with everything that you just said about the increased level of expertise. And I think that I have lost my train of thought. Yeah, I'm not even jet lagged, so go ahead. Maybe I'll come back to it.
So thank you all. That was really fascinating. And as a humanist, I don't often get to hear these types of conversations. So I really appreciate your perspective. And I have never seen a panel so beautifully moderated. So thank you for that as well. I have two naive questions. So I was really excited by the conversation between Mark and Suresh about agnostic form versus specific content. Because it seemed, Suresh, you were saying, in fact, the form is the content because of the scale. And so it sounded to me like what you were having was a conversation about what is knowledge and how is it produced. So my first naive question out of two naive questions is, do you ever talk to epistemologists or philosophers as you think about these issues? Because it seems they might have some bearing. And then the second question I have is, this all sounds to me like the runaway Wild West of the supplement and vitamin industry in the US, which is completely unregulated, whereas medicines and drugs are not unregulated. So is it too naive to hope that at some point social media might be regulated more like the FDA regulates drugs than the current hands-off approach that seems to me analogous to the vitamins and supplements industry, which is not unrelated to misinformation and woo-woo and anti-everything? Thank you.
It's very connected. Who wants to take the epistemological question?
So I will, because the answer is yes. It's funny because I was at a workshop some years ago. I don't know why I got invited, but I was at a workshop with a bunch of philosophers. We were talking about, it was in the context of AI, but it was about AI and about explanations about how to understand what is coming out of an algorithm. And that's when I first was exposed to sort of it wasn't the first time, but it was where I was supposed to practicing epistemologist, thinking about the nature of knowledge, nature of belief, what it means, I heard the term the extended brain, right? When, I don't know the answer, but I'm sure I can Google it in 5 minutes. So in some sense, Google has become my extended brain. But what does that mean? Because now it's not my brain, it's Google's brain. It's our brain collectively. And those kinds of discussions, they were fascinating. And I actually ended up writing a couple of papers with some epistemologists on related topics as a result of that. It's definitely very relevant to these conversations. So thank you for mentioning that.
Oh, sorry, Mark.
No, you go ahead, please.
Well, so that was like probably one of the most interesting questions I've ever heard. And I wish we were forced to think about that more. I probably approach regulation with more of a philosophical hat on than most, mainly because I think when we think about regulation, especially about something like misinformation, I think there's a pretty big question we have to ask ourselves, which is the point of regulation to essentially make sure that people who want to go on alternative sites like Gab and Parler and Truth Social can't do that, and that those sites get shut down, that adults who are technically allowed to go and say whatever they want, should we try to restrict them from accessing that type of content and regulate spaces that are dedicated to misinformation? Or are we trying to protect the average mom of 4 living in Arizona who's going about her day on Facebook and gets recommended an anti-vax group? And to me, I think the first conundrum cannot be solved and should not be solved through regulation, because that to me does seem a bit like Ministry of Truth, government clamping down on what people want to say online, shutting down forums because they're wrong. The other question, which is like, do we want to make sure that average people who don't want to find this content or aren't necessarily looking for it, aren't getting actively recommended to it? That seems to me the bigger focus, and I think the same thing is true for search engines. So I briefly started leading our thinking around search, and the question there is very similar, which is if people want to find illegal content on search engines, is the point of our regulation to try to prevent them from doing so? And are we ever going to succeed? Because people who want to find that content can pretty much find it no matter what. Or do we want to make sure that the average person making pretty normal searches isn't going to come across child sex abuse material or terrorist content or, illegal hate speech or whatever it is? And I think it's really important for regulators to think about those philosophical questions, in large part because it helps to focus the brain on where can we make a difference. Because if we do try to shut down some of those smaller forums, we may actually be wasting our time and kind of going in the wrong direction.
Can I take the second question?
Yes.
So I'm going to take off my very cynical journalistic hat and be an optimist for once. I think that FDA model is coming. Right? We are living, as you say, in the Wild West of social media. That era is over. The platforms, and it's not just Meta, would like some sort of so-called co-regulatory model where they are in the room helping to set the rules. That's not going to happen. Well, it gets complicated, but let's just say that it's not going to happen. In the most optimistic world, with both the European Digital Services Act and to a lesser extent the UK's Online Safety Bill, that regulatory model is here to stay. You are going to see product safety built into some of these product decisions, for the good and for the bad. So I can't say that the outcome is going to be some FDA-style safe internet, because I don't think that's not going to exist. But do I think will it mitigate some of the significant harms that we've seen even in the last six years? Yes. And what's really interesting, and I think this is where the folk in DC have, not you, Rebecca, but like on the Hill are finally waking up to the fact, and also to a degree it doesn't matter what happens in Congress anymore, because they're going to piggyback off Europe and just take the best of that and force the platforms to implement those regulatory measures voluntarily, mostly because those executives sit in the US and they're going to twist some arms. So I think from that perspective, a lot's going to change in the next 2 years.
So we've got a question from Will Kay here, which I love and reminded me that this was a question that I wanted to ask, which is, regulation moves slowly. And we've used the word Facebook a few times in this conversation, and there's probably a few people in this room who are like, you say what now? Like, we're already past Facebook being the problem. And actually, Meta and its metaverse, we had this conversation earlier, Ash, like, how does regulation work when actually technology is moving at such speed? So we're actually regulating the problems from 4 years ago. And actually, Will's talking about, education moves much more rapidly. Like, should we actually be thinking about enforcement of education principles as a form of regulation? So anyway, I'm just interested in Will is, and I am too.
Okay, hi Will. I know who you are. Yeah, I raised this earlier in one of our workshops because we were coming up with metrics that were really relevant to like the news feed. And if the regulators finally get their act together and in 2 years, platforms have to start publishing engagement metrics around content in the news feed, that news feed might not exist anymore. And I think a couple of things. One is, it's really important for people who work within regulators to actually be familiar with and using a lot of the apps we regulate, which seems like a really obvious point until you realize that probably the majority of people who were at Ofcom, I think I'm allowed to say this, when I joined, probably couldn't really tell you the difference between TikTok and Snapchat. And the difference between TikTok and Snapchat is like the difference between regulating like a bicycle and a Hummer. Like they're like fundamentally different, and there's so few levels of comparability. You have no idea of like what features might lead to harm and where users are actually getting a lot of their information and where they might turn to. That I think in order for us to be sort of stay ahead, we actually have to be using a lot of the emerging apps as well. And Ofcom has a basement area where we have, I think, like a couple of Oculus devices, and everyone's encouraged to go try out the metaverse. So I think one of the important areas is for us to actually start to use the product so that we can, when we go into rooms with the people who work at these platforms, we can ask intelligent questions and don't just take for granted what they tell us is in place. But I think the broader point is the kind of what I said earlier, which is ideally, regulation would be proactive enough that the point at which a platform is developing a new feature or an entirely new product, we're there, or at least their trust and safety teams are there to go, hey, wait a minute, we should probably think about this. And a concrete example of this is when Meta did its big pivot from Facebook to the metaverse, and they basically bought Oculus and then tried to essentially sell loads of Oculus devices and get loads of people to sign up. As far as I can tell, and this might be like fact check, so maybe don't live tweet this, but like a big question is like, are they getting people to declare their age at the point of sign up? So does Meta know how old people are in the metaverse? And if they're not doing that, they probably should, because they should probably be aware of what is the experience for someone who's 13 versus someone who's 45. And maybe if there are like virtual strip clubs, the 13-year-olds should not be allowed to find those spaces or get let in. And the reason why it's important to think about that at the point at which you're developing the product is because it becomes a lot more expensive and time-consuming to retroactively fit that product design in when some journalist writes an expose on it like 6 months later. So I think the best way for us to stay ahead is actually to stop focusing on necessarily just the live products and the apps we all use, but actually go to the platforms and say, hey, what are you developing now? What are you working on? Have you thought about the implications of, you know, hosting illegal content and children getting recommended to adults in their friend requests, right? So that's really, I think, where ultimately in my dream world, we would be focusing there, and actually we could be fairly hands-off, and the platforms would have the trust and safety systems in place so that they would actually be thinking about this before we even have to intervene.
I'm going to go to Rebecca in a second, but I think going back to something you said at the beginning about we're hiring, I don't think I'm breaking any secrets that you are potentially not over 30. And the reason I love you so much is because you have a really lived experience of growing up in a digital environment, and you're now sitting around the table with policymakers talking from experience as opposed to, you know, I read about it in a book. So I think there's a real argument here for trying to recruit from people who this is just the norm. Rebecca.
So I could not agree more with everything that you've said, Ash, and also, right, with your point that we need more folks like Ash within regulators. I think the challenge is that none of these regulators are ever going to be big enough and well-resourced enough, and actually you pointed, right, to this earlier when you said that the platforms are going to be changing so quickly and constantly that just keeping up, right, is really difficult. Maintaining a level of core knowledge about the vast variety of platforms that are out there is going to be really challenging. And so I think that there are two things that regulators can be thinking about doing going forward that go hand in hand with one another. The first is developing really solid relationships with independent experts who are specializing in you know, and have knowledge on these individual platforms, and can flag things, right? Flag areas of concern. And the second is setting up the kind of core mechanisms to ensure that there's a systematic way to provide, to get that sort of knowledge into the thinking, into the hands of the regulators. So one of the things that I have grand hopes around the Digital Services Act about, the proof is in the pudding, we'll see if it actually pans out the way that I hope. But because the Digital Services Act is not just asking platforms themselves to perform risk assessments and report back, but is also bringing in independent auditors and independent researchers to help assist in this. We need to do things like develop independent intermediary organizations, right, themselves, that help facilitate the conversations between those researchers that the DSA is empowering and the regulators. And so I think that it's a multi-layered, complex approach to making sure that regulators are keeping up as best possible, though it will never be a totally perfect world.
No, I totally agree. And it makes me think, going back to, we're seated in a school of public health. We have a Centre for Digital Health, and we, you know, talk a lot about mental health, or talk about gun violence, and the thing, like, what's the combination of having experts from public health talking about this and ensuring, because they're often, you know, people that I'm now meeting in public health are often not in these kind of conversations about regulation. So I think there's also expertise in just harm and harm reduction and what's happening, just taking public health as an example. Friends, it's 6:50. Oh, hello, lovely. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah.
Would you like to come to the microphone?
Do I have a choice?
Not really, no.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have sort of a two-part question. The first one is, how do you address concerns of, in that same philosophical line of questioning, how do you address concerns of like violations of free speech or infringement on rights? Because I always have conversations with my friends on the right, and they're like, well, regulation is bad because free speech, this, that, constitution stuff. And then the second part is a little bit in what you were talking about. So you mentioned how for like 10 years you had all your stuff turned off. Like, that's something that I can never imagine doing. So it's like, yes, I know they're collecting my data. I know that they're following me around, but it's like, but I use Instagram 24/7. So it's like, what am I gonna do about that? So then how do you address the fact that my generation don't know anything else besides this world of internet, and we can't really go without it? So then how do you regulate without sort of taking away from our experiences of using the internet?
Thank you for leaving the best till last. Who wants to answer the free speech question?
I'll go, I mean,
Go on.
as the card-carrying journalist, I'll go, it's a tough one. I mean, no one wants free speech to die, right? I mean, but it's a question of, for me, regulation isn't there to stop people saying things, right? But I also feel fundamentally that can you go into, I mean, the example that comes up a lot of time is sort of going into a movie theater and shouting fire, right? There's some harm to that, right? That it could lead to outcomes that aren't optimal, right? And so it's a question of the balance for me on regulation, and to be honest, I do not have a concrete answer for you, how to balance this out, is people should have free speech, but there are limits to a degree. The First Amendment is the First Amendment, and no one's changing it, but there are limits because we live in a society, and there is a contract where you can't just go around saying things that cause harm. You can, but there are consequences to that. I think for regulation, the balance then becomes, no, regulation isn't immediately censorship. You know, regulation can also be beneficial. No one is saying the seatbelts on a car, you know, that came from regulation, but that is a material benefit to society. So as much as the left may be wrong, the right may be wrong, I think we need to have a clear discussion about what the regulation is for, and this is not about Ministry of Truth, this is not about limiting free speech, it's trying to create a safer society, and that is a contract between you as a social media user and your friends, and we all need to be adults in the room and say, maybe if we just turn it back a little bit, we can create a safer, more pluralistic and open online society that benefits everybody.
Everybody wants to say something now. I'll go down the line, and this is your last comment. Suresh.
So I guess I have an answer that I think ties together two different threads of what you're asking. Right? You're talking about free speech, and you're talking about Instagram and your 24/7 life on Instagram, which I don't know if you're recording right now, but okay. So on the free speech question, first of all, I would tell your friends on the right that they should actually read First Amendment doctrine. There are plenty of restrictions on the First Amendment, which, to the extent that the First Amendment is relevant here. Now, the First Amendment is relevant for government sort of regulation of speech. The concept of free speech is a much broader concept that isn't there. That's one thing. And secondly, even in the First Amendment, there is a line around actual incitement to harm, right? And there's a line that gets crossed at that point when there's a determination that's actually called led to harm. Which brings me to your second point about, you can't imagine turning your collection processes off. You like having access to your maps and where have you been and so on. If you change that title to, can regulation solve the harms of misinformation? You probably might get a lot more people saying yes than with it right now. And I keep thinking that, the answer to both your question about the speech and about the problems of data collection, it's not the act of speech itself. It's not the misinformation. It's not the, I have a right to be an idiot in public thing itself, which I frequently do. But it's more like, what is the harm? Can you address what's happening at the point of harm, right? The scam, the financial scam itself is not the problem so much as the fact that someone loses money because of the financial scam. If people are going around shouting about, some ivermectin and no one was taking it, it would be a very different situation, people actually taking the drug and falling sick or dying from it. So I think of it in terms of harm, and in terms of data collection, it's not the collection so much per se as the fact that it gets used and gets inferred and models get built and then inferences get made and geofencing is done. Those are the harms. And I like, at least to stop myself being from totally confused about these topics, I like to think about that. It helps anchor me a bit more in what the concerns are. And so that's how I think about both the issues of speech, where's the harm, and the issue of data, where's the harm.
I think I've actually got quite a controversial take on the whole freedom of speech, freedom of expression side of things, which is, I think a lot of the discussion tends to be really misguided because, and I'm obviously super biased in saying this, I think regulation in many ways is actually going to help hold up freedom of speech and freedom of expression. Because the problem is, we're not operating in a world in which platforms aren't removing content, right? Like they are. And the problem is they're removing content in a way that is non-transparent and is non-accountable. So what I always say to people who are really concerned about freedom of expression, which is how it's called sort of in the UK, you will have for the first time a regulator that can actually get platforms to explain publicly how they're deciding on what information, misinformation to remove and where they draw the line and how much of it they're removing. And there are going to be rules that require the platforms to explain to users why their content was removed. There are no rules around that right now, but there's going to be a lot more transparency towards users around why platforms are taking the actions they're taking. And I think in many ways, the regulation around misinformation in the UK largely centers around greater transparency, which I think is good because, as Claire said, we shouldn't be setting rules for platforms before we know what's actually happening on them. So in many ways, the point of regulation to me is to really bridge that information divide between us not really knowing anything and the platforms knowing everything. And to your second question about Instagram, I actually had to stop using Instagram because I found it so addictive. And I actually grew up with someone who didn't really get to use, I had very strict German parents and I wasn't allowed to watch TV or use social media. And I find it really addictive. I actually can't have TikTok on my phone because I will spend 5 hours on it. But the way that I think about this is, if regulation works, most people won't be able to tell a difference because the experience that they like will continue to be the case. The changes that we might bring in are a lot of the inadvertent stuff that affects vulnerable communities, children, greater parental controls. You might find greater controls over being able to report content or decide what type of content you might see or who you want to see in your feed. But in my ideal world, you wouldn't have a sanitized internet, and I don't think that's what anyone wants either. The things that as a regulator we care about are more on a systems level, our platforms just being completely negligent in the way that they think about, the 13-year-olds who are going to be using their app. Are they letting 13-year-olds or even maybe 10-year-olds use their apps in a way that means that they're very likely to develop, or to encounter harm? You as an adult probably won't see a social media that is much different than the one you see now, except you probably, ideally, you wouldn't be recommended content that isn't harmful. But that's, I think, quite far away. And, I think it's really difficult to say that in the near future we'll be getting to algorithmic level changes through regulation. That's quite hard to imagine.
Rebecca.
I know we're pushing time. So I'll try to be brief, but I do want to try to touch on both of the questions that you asked. One of the things that I think, and maybe I'll back up for just 1 second and say that the core research that I'm doing right now is actually on online abuse and harassment. And taking that lens into the various free speech conversations that we're having, right? One of the things that I think is missing and I think about a lot is that indeed one of the most profound harms of just a sort of free-for-all, digital sphere is that actually, particularly people from marginalized communities, women, and so on, are actually having their voices squelched, silenced, right? And so if we do have a real commitment to free speech, we have to use that lens, we have to inject that element into part of the conversation. To your question about, what do we do when we just can't live without all of these tools that are endlessly collecting data on us, I think that there are two practical things that I would really like to see, especially in the US, pretty quickly. I would like to see regulation of data brokers Those folks who are sweeping up data from a variety of different places, apps, right, all over the place, using all of that tracking data from so many different sources, bringing it all together and selling it on to anybody and everybody. And that brings me to the second thing, which is they're selling it a lot to law enforcement. And I would really like to see, and I don't know how much hope there is of this, but I would really like to see some serious consideration given to regulation that limits law enforcement in particular, but state uses of that sort of information. I don't think that's, to my mind, that's not the ideal stopping point, but it is the most vital starting point right now.
Oof, what a way to end. Thank you so much to the panel. That was a great conversation. I don't think people would have thought that we would have laughed as much around a regulation panel. So thank you very much. If you've enjoyed this one, we have one next Wednesday, Cambridge Analytica 4 years on, with another stellar panel. And if you are interested in the kind of things we're talking about, follow us at IFL_Brown. We have lots of things coming up, live literature reviews, lots of different events, a fellowship program. So again, thank you very much for coming out. If you fancy a little cheeky wine, I think there might be one outside. But it's just such a pleasure to be back in a room with people. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you for people on the live stream. And yeah, let's come back in 2 years' time and see where we are. So thank you very much.